we're linking up with the International Conference in Computational Creativity in Portugal, who I think are watching in. So welcome, Portugal. We're going to have 3 talks on computational creativity inspired by Maggie's work. We're going to start with Mike Wheeler.
Thanks. Okay, so I think the last 2 talks this morning got us to the point where we're beginning sort of transition from some really nice personal memories to sort of academic engagement with Maggie's ideas. And this talk will, given the hookup with the conference in Portugal and so on, we'll continue that. I should say at the outset, though, it's been amazing to hear the sort of heartfelt remembrances, but also the kind of great admiration and respect with which people in this room remember Maggie, and that's just been fantastic. I was Maggie's PhD student between 1992 and 1995, and I certainly wouldn't have had the academic career that I've had if it hadn't been for Maggie's support and her advice and her guidance. So, like many people in this room, I owe a huge debt. Having said that, our supervision sessions were not always, without controversy. Maggie and I would often disagree about things. I was a young revolutionary PhD student who would regularly go in every week and present her with some written stuff, but also arguments that showed why traditional cognitive science was on its knees and how we could change it by going down various new paths. Maggie would often greet this with some really nice things, which I think made our supervision session so wonderful, where she would point me to various people in the history of cognitive science or psychology or philosophy who'd said similar things to the kind of things I was saying, and point out that I really needed to go and read them and see what they said, and was it advanced because they'd been kind of shot out the water in various ways. And this is the way that we engaged for 3 years, and it was amazing. And I also should say, referencing back to some words that were said this morning, these ideas that I would come in and present to Maggie, and she would often treat with a certain amount of skepticism, but always with interest and always with enthusiasm. A lot of these ideas did come from French and German philosophers, so there may be something there I've learned. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about Maggie's work on creativity, but I'm going to do something else that Ernest mentioned this morning, which is I'm going to bring Maggie's work into dialogue with someone who's not a philosopher, but indeed is an artist, a musician, David Byrne, as many of you will know originally from the Talking Heads. And I'm doing that deliberately because I think that's one of the ways that Maggie loved to develop her ideas, as Ernest said, in interaction with practitioners. And Byrne himself has written some really interesting stuff recently on creativity. And I think bringing Maggie's work into this relationship with David Byrne stuff teaches us some really interesting things about creativity. And so that's what I'm going to do for the next period of time. Okay, so here we go. So there's Byrne from Talking Heads. It's going to be mostly Boden, but a good deal of Byrne as well. So I hope you don't get, distracted by the Byrne bits. So here's the famous picture. This has already been mentioned, so I'll do it really quickly. Maggie's account of creativity. This is a famous picture. Maggie, as we know, characterises creativity as the ability to come up with ideas or artefacts that are new, surprising and valuable. And those 3 words are the real sort of touchstones of the theoretical position. And let's just think very quickly about each of these terms. So newness for Maggie is understood in terms of a distinction we've already heard. Distinction between psychological, what she later renamed individual creativity, and that's newness to the person who produces the idea or the artefact. So an individual person producing a created product, is it new to them? Right? It may not be new in the history of mankind. As Maggie was fond to say, imagine your 11-year-old nephew or something comes in and he wrote this thing and it's basically Romeo and Juliet. That would still be really, really creative on their part, even though Shakespeare got there first. But then there's a distinction between that kind of creativity and historical creativity. Right? That's newness in terms of the history of ideas and so on. So that distinction's in play. More importantly for our purposes will be this: 3 kinds of surprise, which Maggie uses to define 3 kinds of creativity. All right, so the first kind of surprise is the unfamiliar combination of familiar ideas. Okay, combinatorial creativity sometimes called. Won't be saying anything more about that today. It's the next 2 that I care about. Then there's this idea that Maggie has of what she calls exploratory creativity. And this is an unexpected idea, one that we wouldn't have expected before, that's revealed by exploring what she calls a conceptual space, an already available conceptual space. Now, I think everybody's going to have an intuitive idea about what a conceptual space is, but I'm going to say a bit more about that in a moment. Then the third kind of creativity is so-called transformational creativity. And that's when we get something that we would think of as an apparently impossible idea, given the prior conceptual space in which we were working. An apparently impossible idea resulting from a transformation of a conceptual space. Examples of this will be given a bit later. So we've got this tripartite distinction. Don't care about the first of these, but I do care about exploratory creativity and transformational creativity. And finally, this notion of value. Remember, a creative idea is one that's new, surprising, and valuable. This is a really interesting concept that would need a whole talk of its own to unravel. I'm not going to do that today. Just know this is the part where Maggie worries about whether you could really have a truly creative artificial intelligence, because she thinks that the valuing side of things is something that can't easily be mechanized or turned into an algorithm or something like that. Doesn't matter about my other comment there. All right, but again, we won't be saying much about that today. All right, so what about David Byrne? As you know, David Byrne's a musician, but he's written this great book called How Music Works that I recommend to everybody. It's got loads more interesting things written about creativity in it than most philosophy texts. And in this, he opposes what he calls the romantic model of creativity, which may well be a kind of not really map onto anybody's actual idea of creativity, but it's a kind of marker in the space. So the romantic model of creativity is when the essential properties of some creative product are determined by certain internal psychological states and processes and are then implemented in the external world. So the example that Byrne gives is, you imagine the writer of a song, and the song wells up inside him, and he's driven by his demons, and he's driven by his need to get this song out, to express this song, and it's going to be just that length and no longer, otherwise it wouldn't be perfect. And all that is set internally, and then it just gets implemented in the external world. Maybe with a bit of interactive fine-tuning to get the guitar transitions right or something like that. So this idea of a kind of internal to external or inside to outside logic of explanation, all the things that make it creative happen inside the artist, inside the human being. Byrne himself says this: I think that the path of creation is almost 180 degrees from the romantic model. I believe that we unconsciously and instinctively make works to fit pre-existing formats. Okay, so this is a really important change in thinking about creativity. So the essential properties of the creative product are determined by certain external structures that are somehow captured by the internal psychological processes doing the work. So the most creative product, the work of true genius, is the one that best fits whatever the external format is in play. So we get a kind of outside to inside logic of explanation in this way of thinking about things. All right, where does Maggie sit on this? Well, I mean, I think she had, as I'll say later, some strongly internalist kind of tendencies in a lot of her work. Maybe you think she'd be close to the romantic model, but actually that's a complicated question that I'll come back to. For the moment, I just want to get Byrne's model right. Now, if we took Maggie's framework and put it next to Byrne's, it might seem like immediately there's going to be a sort of tension, or at least a limitation in what Byrne can do with his model of creativity. If what Byrne's doing is saying that creativity is the fitting of structure to some external format, the most fitting structure is the most creative, then it sounds like we're not going to get transformational creativity, right? It sounds like what we're going to get is exploratory creativity. We might find a new, as it were, point in the mapping onto the external format, but that will be just within an external format. That's not changed, right? The external format is fixed. Now, in saying that, right, I've eluded two concepts deliberately just to get the idea up. I've eluded conceptual spaces and Byrne's notion of external formats. Right. Remember, Maggie's view of exploratory creative activity is finding a space in a pre-existing conceptual space, a new position in that space. Byrne's talking about a way of creating something that maps onto a in some sense external structure, like a conceptual space, but he's not talking about conceptual spaces. He's talking about these things called pre-existing formats. So we need to understand this distinction between Maggie's notion of conceptual spaces and Byrne's notion of pre-existing formats. And then we'll see where we are. Okay, so here's what Maggie says. She says conceptual spaces are structured styles of thought or disciplined ways of thinking. These are the classic statements of what a conceptual space is. And her flagship examples include things like genres of music, right? So hip hop or something. Genres of dance, particular kinds of ballet or whatever, visual art and architecture. You can see the idea, as well as scientific theories and styles of cooking, right? It's a broad kind of term that covers a lot of these spaces, but these are conceptual spaces. They're styles of thinking or structured styles of thought. Now, these are not what Byrne means when he's talking about creativity as kind of fit into an external format. Byrne's notion of external or pre-existing formats encompasses a wide range of otherwise disunified physical, social, and technological structures. So here are some examples. Okay, so here's Byrne here's my favourite. Okay, this is the punk club CBGB's in New York. When Byrne thinks about CBGB's, he's thinking this is one of these pre-existing formats, right? So how is it that the musicians who play at CBGB's or write songs as they play in bands that play at CBGB's, how is it that that's providing a kind of structure to which the songs, the music are being fitted? Well, the idea is that CBGB's is not just a physical location. I'll talk about that in a minute. It's a whole scene, right? CBGB's had some great rules, like that all the musicians who played there were allowed to drink there for free on other nights. So there was always a whole bunch of creative musicians standing around talking at the bar. They also, because of the area of New York it was in, a lot of the musicians lived locally, so they took advantage of drinking free in CBGB's. So there's a whole kind of scene, and this is the kind of thing that Byrne's talking about. But it does matter about the physical space as well. Interesting thing about CBGB's, because of the structure of the place physically, it was a place that had very low reverberation. That means you can play very intricate guitar parts. No one told the Ramones that, by the way, but you can. At the same time, it was really noisy. If anyone, I was at CBGB's, it's really, really noisy. So you had to play really loud, but you could play very intricately. And for Byrne, that's one of the things that the music he was writing in the Talking Heads was fitted to. It could be really loud, it's punk, or new wave music, but very intricate guitar-wise. And we see that in other CBGB's bands like Television as well. He also thinks of social expectations as part of external formats, right? So famously, Scott Joplin said that the only reason we have jazz improvisation is because people in ragtime audiences could dance for a lot longer than the songs, right? So improvisation started. So what's the story about improvisation? Well, it's an external format to which the music became fitted. And just a final example, technological innovations. When records came out, you could only get about 3 or 4 minutes on either side. So people started to write songs that length. More importantly and interestingly, classical composers started putting decrescendos in about 3 to 4 minutes into their music, and then crescendos after that, so they could be fitted on the either side of 2 records. So these sort of features of the creativity come from fitting the creative product to these external formats. All right. Now, importantly, what Byrne says is that formats are guidelines that can steer you away from what might at first seem like obvious choices or logical moves. Right? They steer the Talking Heads into playing the kind of music that they play. So that steering could be a kind of exploratory creativity, or Television, for instance, use of technically proficient dual guitar interplay within a musical subgenre born of garage rock. I'm sure I put that in Wikipedia. It doesn't sound like me. But anyway, so guiding us to unexplored territory in a possible conceptual space, a subgenre like garage rock. But here's a bit of unexplored territory in that space that the external format, things like CBGB's physical structure, guides us to. More importantly, you can transform your established conceptual spaces. Take Patti Smith's fusion, perhaps might be not your favourite example, but I like it. Fusion of punk rock and poetry, something that could happen in a place like CBGB's. So basically the idea is that pre-existing formats are not, the process of adaptive fitting to pre-existing formats are not limited to Maggie's second mode of creativity, just the exploratory creativity. We can get transformational creativity out of the way this works. Okay, here's the last thing on Byrne before we get back to Maggie. We can think of this on a kind of Darwinian model if we want. We can think about creativity as a kind of adaptive fitting. And Byrne himself does that. He talks about African percussive music as, and here's what he says, a living thing that evolved to fit the available niche. Right, so all the constraints about the social sort of requirements for the percussive music in the African tribe cultures, and also the kind of noise and everything that needed to be produced over very loud backdrops, all these things right, set the niche to which the creative product is then adaptively fitted. So we can think about Byrne's understanding of creativity on a kind of Darwinian model, and he does it too. And in this kind of model, transformational creation might be thought of as a kind of speciation event, right? We adapt the creative product to some kind of external format, but because of the particular properties of that external format, we end up producing a wholly new form, right? So we can see this kind of Darwinian model at work. And I think some of the work that's been done recently in the predictive processing framework on artistic cognitive niches as structures that move the goalposts for our predictive mechanisms, for those who care about such things, fits this kind of model too. I want to put Andy's papers there, he's good on that. All right, okay, so that's the kind of, we've got this comparison. So where are we, right? So maybe you think, so what, right? Perfectly reasonable question at this point. Well, here's where we've got, according to me. Okay, sorry, I'm back. So although there was initially this worry that if you had this kind of adaptive fitting model of creativity that Byrne has, you could only get exploratory creativity at best, that doesn't seem right. Okay, once we understand the distinction between formats and conceptual spaces, what we've got is the idea that formats do not limit what can be done with respect to conceptual spaces. So we can have our recognizably Boden-esque framework, which I recommend in terms of the idea of these different notions of creativity, which seems like a useful tool for understanding creativity. We can plug in this Byrne-style stuff, and we're still rocking. So the notion of pre-existing formats, together with this idea of adaptive fitting, what I think it does is expand the theoretical resources available to explain how conceptual spaces are explored and transformed. A lot of Maggie's work on creativity, picking up on the AI and cognitive science of time, is, thinks about these things in terms of like internal means and analysis algorithms or pattern matching algorithms in the brain. But here's a whole other story about how conceptual spaces might be explored and transformed that has a different kind of feel about it. But it doesn't ruin the framework, right? It works with the framework. Okay, but 3 issues now come to the fore. And then the rest of this talk will be just exploring these to see where we go, if we make some progress. So I think there is still a tension here. It's with something that Maggie wrote in some of her later work on creativity, on personal signatures in art. I'll explain what that is. As a result of the expansion I just talked about, thinking about external or these pre-existing formats as kind of the drivers of creative structure, what we get is Maggie's tendency towards a kind of conventional internalism. I'm going to say a bit about that because we have to handle that very carefully, what I've just said there. That internalism becomes less attractive, and I'll talk us through that in a moment. And then the thing I really want to care about, see, because I said I would often come into supervision with Maggie and put out some mad idea. Crazy idea that she would roll her eyes and then we'd laugh about it. So it's very interesting, of course. So I'm going to do that today because in memory of our PhD supervision sessions, I'm going to then present you with a completely crazy idea towards the end that I think is true, by the way. We'll get to that. Okay, personal signatures in art. Maggie says that, so personal signatures when we can look at a piece of artwork and we can at least, hopefully under good conditions, tell who the artist is by various features of the creative product. Maggie argues in a really great little piece, one of her later pieces, that these are not primarily about the artist wanting to consciously stamp their own mark on a work, which is what you might think they're all about. She thinks they're just a side effect of exploratory creative activity. All right, so the style is predetermined. Remember, when we're in exploratory creativity, we're finding a new place within an existing conceptual framework, right? So the style is predetermined in exploratory creativity, but the individual instances are not. That's the key move. So there'll be these variations at the level of individual artists, even though they're sticking to the same generic style across a school or whatever. Perhaps this is true of transformational creativity, or those worries there about whether personal signatures carry across the transformational barrier. So, think of Picasso's early work and later work. Do they have the same personal signature? Anyway, different issue. I think Maggie was quite nervous about what to say about that, and I have no idea. Also, Maggie thought they were driven by issues of computational efficiency. It was the idea that, artists, they develop this little way of perhaps drawing a mouth, and they keep doing it, and that's really efficient computationally. Don't try and do it very differently next time when you've got a nice little mouth model. Okay, we'll come back to that. Now, I think that second question of computational efficiency doesn't move me. I haven't got time to really go into why. It doesn't move me. I suspect these days we might be more inclined to think of kind of various kind of idiosyncratic bodily habits that produce the kind of more inactive kind of story. But I'm not so worried about that. It's the first one I really care about here. I think there's no doubt that Maggie's right about that, number one there. And so I think when we think about Byrne's outside to inside logic of explanation, something about that's going to have to give. Because the nice way to think about this is think about two CBGB's bands, right? Think about Talking Heads and Television, both driven by the same physical environment with low reverberation but really noisy crowds, driven by the same scene, they're playing at the same time. And they both got really intricate guitar work and they both played really loud, right? There's a lot of similarities there in the way that they approach things, but they're very different bands, right? So it's like there's definite variation at this more detailed level. So I think Maggie there's quite a personal signatures and art thing. It's really important that Byrne's story can't be quite as simple as he wants to tell it. So 1-0 there to Maggie's picture, I think. Here I want to be a little bit more, don't know what the right word is, nuanced or careful. Think about this outside to inside explanation. So we're going to buy the story, the Byrne-like story, that what artists do is, particularly I'm talking about music a lot today, that they're producing these products to fit some external formats, some pre-existing formats. That's what determines in the structure of the creative product, modulo personal signatures. You could have a completely internalist story about that, right? You could say that what happens is the artist, the musician, say, looks at this external format, internally models the reverberation, internally models various aspects of the scene, and then trundles some algorithms, whether they be pattern matching or predictive or classical, I don't care, trundle some little internal algorithms, and out comes the product, right? You can have a completely internalist story about that. But I just think that there's something about the Byrne picture that doesn't reward that. I think the Byrne picture makes us begin to think in a more what we would now call embedded way about the intelligence that goes on in creativity. So much more about the kind of relationship between the internal and external factors, with the external factors perhaps doing quite a lot of the work here, and not big internal models representing the reverberation. It's just that when Byrne writes his songs, they come out a certain way because he knows next week they're going to be in CBGBs, right? He doesn't have a model of that. It's just the way they turn out, due to the way he's written songs in the past and so on. So if you wanted to say that something is an embedded sort of story about cognition these days, we would say something like this. Creative thought is routinely and perhaps sometimes necessarily causally dependent in interesting ways, that's a weasel word I'm not going to talk about, say, on the bodily exploitation of environmental scaffolds, right? So this kind of interaction between the internal and the external, where the external is doing quite a lot of work. And here's the important thing about that. Although Maggie had some pretty robust internalist tendencies, she undoubtedly recognises the existence of this kind of creativity. And it's in work with Ernest that she does that. So in the excellent What is Generative Art paper, that they make a distinction between computer-assisted art, where the computer functions merely as a tool that remains under the close direction of the artist, rather like an extra paintbrush or a sharper chisel, and computer-based generative art, where the artwork is produced in part by abstract rules implemented by a computer in a manner not under the artist's direct control, such that the computer is, as they put it, partly responsible for coming up with the idea itself. So here we have this external structure that's partly responsible for coming up with the idea itself. It's a very strongly embedded story, right? So to think of Maggie as a sort of, a complete internalist with no sort of subtlety with respect to these kind of inactive or embedded stories, it would be to get it wrong. So it's very important to see that. But it does push us in this more embedded direction, I think, Byrne stuff. Right, last thing I'm going to talk about. Good, I'm running on time. I want to now really go big picture, really big picture. Maggie's project with respect to creativity was a demystification project, right? It was to take this thing, creativity, that we think is kind of weird in all kinds of ways and special and only possessed by a few in its fullest form and all this kind of stuff, and completely bring that within the remit of something that doesn't have any mystical kind of effects. So here's a way of getting a grip on this. This is from Gilbert Ryle, actually, a great Oxford philosopher, in a paper of his called Improvisation, which hardly anybody has ever read. He wrote it after he retired. I'm recommending this paper to you all now. I'm going to refer to it again in a minute. It's a work of it's a fantastic piece of work. Here's what Ryle says. Creativity is often treated as an inspiration from one of the 9 muses, or an interference by the goddess of fortune, or the intervention of a contrived mental faculty of intuition. Now, if you see what Ryle's saying, that's the way we stand, and it's linked to the romantic vision of creativity that Byrne wants to resist. Maggie's attempt to explain creativity, or at least key aspects of it, by appeal to mechanisms identified by AI and cognitive science, aims to demystify creativity, to not see it as an intervention by the goddess of fortune or a special faculty that we can't explain in ways that we would explain other psychological faculties. Creativity isn't a separate faculty distinct from perception, reasoning, memory, imagination, but rather it's exhausted by a canny combination of those very capacities, all mechanistically explained somehow, whether that's by classical algorithms or neural networks or predictive processing. I don't care, right? What shall we do? Some kind of demystification story that appeals to the mechanisms that AI looks at. Now, I'm not going to argue for this today, I haven't got time. Arguably, this reductionist strategy falls short, or to be more accurate, shorter than Maggie suggests, because she thinks there are limits. I talked about value earlier on. To get into this would be to get into issues of relevance and the frame problem, something about which Maggie and I could never agree. But I'm not going to get into that today. But I'm going to suggest that reductionist strategy has got limitations. I suggest we do something quite kind of revolutionary, that we turn things around. Right? What we do is we reprogram the challenge, and we say that perception, reasoning, etc., are intrinsically creative. So we don't explain creativity in terms of these other phenomena. We embed creativity in these other psychological phenomena, and we see each of them as themselves creative acts. And of course, you've got to make sense of this idea without inviting the mystery back in, right? So once you've chucked the vampire out, don't invite them through your door, right? Buffy never learned that. And so we've got to do this without getting creativity all mysterious again. So I'm going to suggest a way of doing this, and I guarantee Maggie would not have liked this, right? We would have discussed it, and she just said, that's very interesting. Go away and convince me of it. And that's great. It's exactly what you need. Thinking is intrinsically creative, I think, because thinking is improvisation. That's all there is to it. That's what thinking is, a kind of improvisation. Every thought is an improvised creative act. And here's Gilbert Ryle saying the same thing. Thinking, I declare quite generally, is at the least the engaging of a partly trained wits in a partly fresh situation. It's the pitting of an acquired competence or skill against an unprogrammed opportunity, obstacle, or hazard. That actually is often used as a definition of improvisation in the contemporary improvisation literature, where Ryle's paper is often read. So I think thinking itself is improvisation. Necessarily so. Like Ryle. Other people have been saying things a bit like this. Sepulveda Pedro, cracking new theorist in the enactivist tradition, argues explicitly that jazz improvisation is the model for thinking. Right? Now, I would have to say a lot to convince you of this, of course, more than I've got time to say. What I do want to do is give you two ways of demystifying, or two steps towards demystification that start from here. And that's the last thing I'm going to do today. So hopefully finish pretty much on time. Improvisation involves a Byrne-like engagement with pre-existing formats. Scott Joplin on Ragtime, lots of other examples of that. Anybody who's ever played improvised music will know that there's this response to the environment around you, and you're going to engage with these pre-existing formats to make the music fit those formats. There's other things going on as well, designing in chance, taking control of constraints. I think that's all going on as well. These are features of creativity in general. Steve Torrance got some nice stuff on this in some of his writing on improvisation, very similar sort of thought. Contemporary accounts of music improvisation often don't cleave improvisation from other forms of creativity. So you think, what he's changed? He's changed the subject matter, right? He was talking about creativity. Now he's talking about improvisation. They're different. No, actually, I think we can see improvisation and creativity as tightly interlinked. Improvisation, what we call improvisation, is just one form of creativity that has all the same features. Someone else who thought this was Schoenberg, who said composing is slowed down improvisation. There you go. So just an appeal to authority there. Pretty stern authority, though. Look at that. You wouldn't disagree with him. All right. So that's just a step, right? To see improvisation. I say thinking is improvisation. That's why it's intrinsically creative, right? I think that's going to go for perception. It's going to go for reasoning in general. First step towards seeing the link with creativity is to see improvisation and creativity is very much on a par. And here's the last thing to say. When you look at the mechanisms that contemporary research is looking at, in this room, we've all grown up in a certain kind of, most of us have grown up in a certain kind of intellectual environment. We're going to reach for AI, but you don't have to reach for AI, right? You can reach for other bits of psychology. And as some of you will know, if you go to memory research right now, you're going to find something that for a lot of people will feel really surprising. And that's that people in memory research increasingly think of memory as an active process of constructing or reconstructing experiences that happened in the past. Not as a way of recalling some stored model of that experience that you put down at the time. So classic kind of database model of memory would be, I have this experience, loads of it gets laid down in my brain. When I remember this experience 2 hours time, I just call up that. But that's not how contemporary psychologists thinking about memory increasingly approach the subject. Rather, they think of memory as a kind of process in which what we do is to, in a particular, memory is a way of guiding our behaviour into future sensible actions. And what they see us doing is, as it were, trying to reconstruct past experiences, given current context, what we know, what we're doing, and what we're feeling about. And often these memories are not going to meet accuracy conditions with respect to the past. But that's what memory is doing all the time. Remembering is a creative, indeed an improvised act that has all the features of creativity, of external formats, fitting, and all the kinds of things we talked about. So here's the model, right? We demystify creativity. We think of creativity as something that's there in all cognition. Creativity first, right? But we demystify it not with respect to the mechanisms that stand in it at the moment, are thought about in AI and cognitive science, but rather with these kinds of mechanisms that are increasingly coming from other areas of psychology. Won't bother with that. That's just a way of thinking, several beta Pedro again. Last thing to say. So how does this play with respect to Maggie's demystification project? Well, I want to buy the project, right? I also think she sort of gets the last word here in a lovely way, which is that Maggie was fond of pointing out that creativity is a feature of intelligence in general. That's just a quote, right, from personal signatures in art. Now, I know that's not the way I've just interpreted that. Is not the way Maggie interpreted it when she wrote that quote, right? She thinks that this is about thinking of everybody in this room as creative, not just Picasso, right? But I think she gets the last word in a much more interesting way, because we now need a model of creativity that will apply generally to thinking, right, and to perception and to reasoning. And I have no reason why Maggie's analytical model of 3 forms of surprise shouldn't apply to that. So I think what's really great, I would try, if I had more time, I would talk more about this. We now have access to a stronger versions of Maggie's democratization of creativity. Because these 3 kinds of surprise, the combination of ideas, exploratory creativity, transformational creativity, they're now plausibly part of everyday thinking. And the more I think about ordinary conversations, the more I think this has to be right. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. So we've got about 5 minutes, and we can do some questions. Hopefully it will work.
So thanks, that was really, really, really easy. And the paper that I wrote with Frank Schumann, actually we didn't refer to Maxwell. We should. Thanks for putting up with this one. I just wanted to make one comment about the picture of improvisation that we got there. Maybe 2. And there was a table that we produced where we talked about 2 sort of ends, as it were, of a spectrum of improvisation, where there was sort of safe routine at the one hand and radical, edgy, boundary breaking at the other end. And we looked at jazz in terms of the way things could vary between one and the other. And what's interesting, when the discussion of creativity that you've sort of presented here, that was very much part of Maggie's framework too, is almost all about surprise, originality, newness, novelty. Whereas I'll leave out the word creativity for a moment, but at the other end, at the safe end of this sort of performance and improvisation, it's something more like what used to be called the well-wrought urn. It's an example of something which is quite standard, but this is a beautiful instance of something which many copies, and it's been well executed. And it's not about newness and about departure. And I would argue that at least part of what creativity is about this safe end of creativity.
Absolutely.
And I just make one point in relation to Maggie. Maggie used to be very proud of her daughter's work in what she called craft. I once heard her give a paper on craft as opposed to art, which, as I interpreted it, and if Shahan's here,
Yeah.
she can correct me, is about trying to produce beautiful examples of things which deliberately don't try to do departure in order to break barriers. Good.
I'd say there's a lot there, right? And I said, obviously, there's a lot of unpacking of this. I've been doing a much longer talk. Let me say one thing. I think you're right. We've got to be careful where you analyse kind of newness and adaptive fitting. Right? I mean, to the extent that adaptive fitting is part of creativity, right, an aspect of improvisation, then of course it could involve the rote phrases put down in a particular way. There is a sense in which the context would still be new, right? And perhaps the fitting to that context. So although the phrase played might be the same, it's a different context and thus has a certain newness. But you're clearly right. There's a spectrum of cases. I want to go from the other end. I think I've been working recently with 3 improvising orchestras, right? And what's really interesting, we did a festival in Berlin where the Trondheim Jazz Orchestra and the Splitter Orchestra, really great Berlin free improvising orchestra, played together. And in this project, that was part of the game, was to get these different kinds of musicians to play together. And you should have heard the number of rules they gave themselves before they did the free improvisation, right? You know, who was going to lead, how long it was going to last. And then they did one improvisation that was just astonishing, but where they made up these rules, which said things like, everybody has to play, but you mustn't obscure any other instrument, and you must play as little as possible. And then they did a free improvisation on the festival like that, which scared the living hell out of the double bass player, because every time she played, she knew she was taking everybody else out. And so it was a really interesting thing. So even in the super free improvising end, it appears that these kind of rules and constraints, laying down formats and fitting them plays a really big role. So I think the spectrum is really quite complicated, but I take the point there's more to be said about internal structure.
Great, thanks, Mike. Thanks again.